On June 25, 1975, the world's largest democracy became a dictatorship overnight. There were no tanks in the streets and no military coup. The entire takeover was completely legal. To understand how this happened, you must look at the early 1970s. India was reeling from a global oil shock, harsh droughts, and skyrocketing inflation. As the cost of living soared, the immense popularity of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi began to collapse. Anger spilled into the streets. Grassroots movements and massive union actions, most notably a 3-week national railway strike led by veteran socialist George Fernandez, shut down the country's infrastructure, explicitly aiming to paralyze the government. A democracy faces its greatest stress test when an entrenched leader is pushed to the absolute brink, facing a real threat of losing power entirely. The legal collapse of Prime Minister Gandhi's premiership began in a local courtroom. In June 1975, the Allahabad High Court convicted the Prime Minister of electoral fraud. The ruling was devastating. Her previous election was declared null and void, and she was legally banned from holding any public office for 6 years. Instead of resigning, Gandhi's team utilized a specific vulnerability in the Constitution. Article 352 allowed the president to declare a national emergency if the country's security was threatened by war or by an undefined internal disturbance. She bypassed her own cabinet, making the decision in isolation. On the night of June 25th, acting entirely on her verbal advice, the president signed the emergency declaration just before midnight. Democracies rarely collapse because an army storms the Capitol. They unravel when politicians weaponize vaguely written constitutional loopholes. The first move was to silence the press. That same night, the government cut power to the major newspaper offices located on Delhi's Fleet Street, ensuring the next morning's papers could never reach the public. At the exact same time, police launched Operation Midnight Knock. Without warrants or specific charges, they swept through the country, arresting tens of thousands of political opponents, union leaders, and student activists. When families appealed to the courts to find their missing relatives, the final defense of the democracy gave way. In the ADM Jabalpur case, the Supreme Court ruled 4-1 that during an emergency, citizens had no legal right to life or personal liberty. The state could lock anyone up with zero judicial oversight. Only one judge, Justice H.R. Khanna, wrote a dissenting opinion, arguing that human rights exist independent of the Constitution and cannot simply be switched off. This stance ended his career. He was passed over for the position of Chief Justice shortly after. When the highest court surrenders its oversight, the executive branch is left with absolute authority, completely untethered from the law. The vacuum of accountability was filled by the Prime Minister's younger son, Sanjay Gandhi. He held no elected office and had no formal governmental authority, yet he effectively commanded ministers and police as a supreme power. This chart shows the scale of the state's population control program. Under extreme coercion, citizens were denied basic rations and healthcare unless they submitted to forced sterilization. Procedures skyrocketed to over 80 lakh in a single year, primarily targeting the poor and vulnerable. In total, nearly 11 million people were sterilized. Sanjay also orchestrated aggressive city beautification drives. Slums were bulldozed, displacing thousands into the outskirts of the city. When residents at Turkman Gate protested the demolition of their homes, police opened fire on the unarmed crowd, killing at least 20 people. In response to this state machinery, a silent underground resistance began to form. Activists used cyclostyle machines in secret to print pamphlets and bulletins, spreading news of the atrocities across the country while evading the police. When the formal structures of democracy are weaponized against the public, resistance is forced into the shadows, and marginalized citizens pay the ultimate price. After 21 months of absolute power, Indira Gandhi made a fatal miscalculation. In January 1977, she abruptly lifted the emergency and called for fresh elections. Her intelligence agencies, fearing the consequences of reporting the truth, had fed her false reports that the public was deeply supportive of her rule. But beneath the enforced silence, the public was boiling with fury. The fractured opposition parties quickly unified into a single alliance with one clear message. The upcoming vote was a choice between democracy or dictatorship. The result was a political earthquake. The ruling party was obliterated across North India. Both Indira and Sanjay Gandhi lost their own seats, and Morarji Desai was sworn in to lead the first non-Congress government in India's history. An autocrat's greatest vulnerability is their own echo chamber. The fear they demand inevitably blinds them to the silent, growing fury of the masses. The new government documented the abuses of the previous 2 years, while prioritizing a permanent rewrite of the constitutional code. They needed to patch the specific vulnerabilities that had been exploited to bypass democratic checks. Through the 44th Amendment, they installed rigid security patches. They replaced the vague term internal disturbance with the requirement of an armed rebellion. Furthermore, a prime minister could no longer declare an emergency alone. They now required the written approval of the entire cabinet. But the ultimate safeguard was correcting the Supreme Court's failure. The amendment established that Article 21, the fundamental right to life and personal liberty, can never be suspended under any circumstances, even during a state of emergency. The 21-month emergency proved that any constitution has vulnerabilities that autocrats will try to exploit. But the 1977 election proved that a democracy's ultimate unhackable failsafe is the undeniable power of its people.